Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we're joined by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, also known as the Pragmatic Programmers. Welcome both to The Cynical Developer.
Well, thank you. It's nice to see there's three of us now.
Yes. Yeah, we had a little bit of a technological issue to start with.
I meant the cynical part, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say that's quite a crowd there for cynical developers.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being cynical towards absolutely everything, especially with the way that technology moves so quickly now. It's always a case of, should I be bothered to be interested in this new piece of tech? Because there's so much.
I try to avoid it because it's easy to fall into the trap of cynicism and kind of lose hope. But it's just so easy to fall into. It's like, oh no, this time I'll have a more mature outlook. I won't be cynical about something. And then you see that, oh, now the latest trend in NPM is to maybe they're going to put ad blockers in because of all the. It's just
yeah.
This is
there's a big difference though between cynicism and skepticism. All right. I mean, cynicism is quite a negative, like, Eeyore type emotion. But I mean, the reality is that you say things are changing so fast, and 90% of them are just rehashes of, stuff that was done before. And, with some developers, particular fashion or style on top of it. So I think skepticism in the face of new things is actually not unwarranted at the moment.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that's something we actually talk about in our book, in the Pragmatic Programmer, is not necessarily skepticism, but certainly to engage critical thinking. Not to accept some vendor's promises or to buy into the hype of whatever the latest fad might be, and kind of look through that and take a closer look at, will this actually work for me in my context with the problems I need to solve?
Yeah. I spent a small amount of time trying to be on the bleeding edge of technology, and you find yourself just hitting walls and hitting walls and hitting walls. And then you get so far with the project and you find out, well, actually, this doesn't even deliver what we needed it to deliver. So I try and step back a little bit. And I'm not quite an early adopter, but I'm an early-ish adopter. And I keep getting quoted quite a lot recently as saying that during this talk, there's been 45 JavaScript frameworks released and 13 of them have died. So, I don't like to jump on the bandwagon straight away, especially with stuff like JavaScript frameworks, because they'll come out with version 1, version 1.5, version 2, and then all of a sudden there'll be massive breaking changes and you've already bought into that ecosystem and it's a huge, expensive change.
I think there's also this thing where you've got... You're doing a really difficult job, right? And so we're coding away and we reach some kind of problem. And we're not 100% sure why we're hitting this problem, but clearly it can't be our fault. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to go find a different framework to use, And you cycle through. I mean, and as you say, particularly in JavaScript, but it happens all over the place. It happens in Ruby, happens in Elixir. You're trying a framework and you can't get it to work. And so therefore it must be the framework's fault. You throw it away and you start again. And after 3 days, you get back to exactly the same position. And guess what? It doesn't work either.
Yep.
And, at what point do you stop and say, there's a common factor here?
Yeah. And as Dylan Beatty says in one of his songs, like, I want to build a framework. Everybody hits that point where they go, well, I've not found something out there that does this job for me, so I'm going to build my own. And they build this massive framework around this one little, very niche problem that they have that they could probably have solved with a couple of lines of code and using something else.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we're under such time pressure. We're under such pressure to deliver. There's never time to sort of, invent the big thing you want to, even though we do. So we try to see, okay, someone else has done this. Let me grab this framework. Let me grab this library. And it's got this one little thing I need, and 80% of this other fluff and crap that I don't need, but I'll suck it in just because I think it'll save me time for this one thing. So you end up with this tremendous bloat, this tremendous, technical debt of all this stuff that you've accumulated, when yes, you could have solved it with, a couple lines of shell script and a cron job, or whatever,
Yeah, and it's personally, I blame blame DHH. I think David Heinemeier Hansson has a lot of skin in this game, not deliberately, but his success with Rails turned people's heads a bit, and people were saying, oh, frameworks. And I think everyone is trying to be the next Rails or whatever it might be, sometimes explicitly. And I think that's part of the big mistake, that really it's I mean, you could argue that Rails was actually a genuine extraction from the 37 signals stuff. And so I think that was done in the right spirit. But a lot of people, like Andy said, just kind of like want to put their marker somewhere and write a framework. And the downside of that is not just the proliferation of frameworks, it's the proliferation of dependencies to those frameworks. So you include like anything in a project, and you're lucky if you get away with less than 500 additional dependencies getting dragged in, because that thing will depend on 10 things, and those 10 things each depend on another 10 things, and so it goes,
Yeah, and as you say, people are always out there trying to put their mark on the industry, and I've even fallen victim of that. I started writing my own ORM.
Oh no!
Yeah, it started out as a wrapper for Dapper, to keep it rhyming, because I didn't like giving devs the ability to do or to abuse C# to do the heavy lifting that SQL should be doing. And I wanted them to use stored procedures. So I wrote a little wrapper around it so that you could write Fluent API and it would produce the nice syntactical SQL for you. And if you want to do anything more than basic CRUD or anything like that, you use stored procedures. But then once I built all that, I was like, well, if I just give it a SQL connection, it doesn't need Dapper. But then I ported that to Core, and that's been sat now for probably a couple of years where I've done nothing with it, because it's one of those of, yeah, it was interesting while I was building it, but is it something that I want to keep maintaining? Is it something that people actually want to use? Probably not.
Yeah, it's funny.
I have a question. This is an underlying question that has bothered me for sometimes, and I think you just walked right into it, right? You wanted to write this thing essentially to stop people from doing something stupid,
yeah,
or something that was suboptimal. And so this is kind of an overarching question. How much do we have in the way of frameworks or libraries that aren't there for convenience or for extended abilities, but are solely motivated by stopping people from doing something stupid? And you can say the same for methodologies too. Why do we have Scrum? Why do we have, whatever? How much of this we put in place in a vain attempt, a useless attempt to keep people from doing something stupid? And wouldn't it be better just to have people be a little smarter in the first place?
Well, the other side of that coin, I think, is that I would suggest every single framework is there to stop people doing what the framework writer thinks is stupid.
Yes, good clarification.
And I think that the thing about that is that I'm kind of getting sick of the kind of censorious nature of development, where there's a right way, which is always my way. And, we have camps, we have mobs, we have, all this flaming going on. And we have constant churn as, the tide of battle rages back and forth across the landscape. I wish we could just stop this kind of evangelizing of do it this way and really just like sit down and do it. And then maybe at the end say, okay, I just finished this project and these 3 things worked for me and these 2 things didn't. And, let people make up their own mind.
Well, and this is part of the problem with, developers' identity. And I've said this a lot, but, we tend to over-identify with whatever tech, whatever language, whatever framework we're using. So you'll be at a conference or a meetup or some such, and people will introduce themselves. I'm a Java programmer. I'm a C# programmer.
That's an AA meeting. That's what that
yeah,
is.
Exactly. I haven't written C# in 3 days. Yeah. But and that's nuts. It's crazy to tie yourself that tightly to whatever the language of the day is, or the framework of the day, or whatever. we're problem solvers. That's what we do. That's what we should concentrate. That's what we should focus on is, hey, this problem came up and here's this nifty way I solved it. And I use these half dozen different technologies or this little bit of something, or I wrote this from scratch, or yes, I found this library, this gem, this, hex package, whatever, and fixed it for me. But that's where the real meat of it is. But that takes effort, that takes thought, that takes work. And, we're always looking for the shortcut.
Yeah, I think that the utopia that Dave was mentioning there, I think the problem you've got with that is that developers have egos, and it's all about, I'm better than you and I do it in a better way than you do. And I'm yet to work in a team that doesn't have at least one or two of these people that it's their way or it's no way at all. And I've always sort of said to people that don't be precious about the way you do it. So, for example, I'd go into a business and bring in coding standards, but I'd say that these aren't my standards. These are based off how you as a team write your code. And you don't have to buy into it. You just have to write the code that way so that it's unified. You don't have to agree with everything. But don't be upset if we don't go with your decision, because there's a million right ways to do something, but there is definitely a handful of wrong ways to do it.
Well, actually, I would take it
around. I think there's like 7 right ways to do it and about a million wrong ways to screw it up. But
I think the whole thing is a false dichotomy. I don't think there are that many right or wrong ways. I think that there are just ways. And I think the trick is, I mean, if I was on that team, what I would be saying is, okay, that's a really interesting idea. So what we're going to do is, I need you to come and think of some metrics we can use to measure whether it's better or worse. And if you can come up with some metrics, then we'll try it your way for 2 weeks or whatever long, however long it takes to get some decent stats. We'll try it your way. And if it's better, then we've all learned something. If it's worse, we've all learned something, you know? But I think there's all these arguments about my way is better are all kind of really, really, they're built on sand, Unless you actually measure, you don't know.
Yeah, my sort of stance with sort of sticking with that coding standards way is that no matter how big the team is, if we're working on a project that's in a particular language, that I would like to open any one of those class files and not be able to tell who wrote those bits of code. It should just
sure,
be
but
code.
that's all. That's just an opinion, right? How do you know that's better?
Okay.
But how do you know that's better? How do you know that is a worthwhile thing to believe in?
Yeah. I guess that it's hard to quantify with actual statistics because we've never looked into it. But I think that from experience, I would say that if you've got 7, 8, 9, 10 of you all working the same way, writing your code in the same sort of style, is that you open it up and you readily know what that code does by a glance. You're not having to work out because maybe somebody does some weird obscure thing with some syntax that
right. So what you're looking at there is, and this I think is vitally important, it's not a question of right versus wrong. It's a question of trade-offs and consequences. So in this particular case, you're saying, well, I'm willing to make this trade-off of maybe not writing in the brace placement style that I like or the naming convention that I like, but I'm willing to accept that because I get this benefit of clarity, acceptability, people working trade, whatever your set of things are. But I think it's vitally important to frame these sorts of questions of what are the trade-offs, what are the consequences of this decision? Because this isn't a morality play. There's no right or wrong here, but things have side effects. And we often don't make any kind of effort to try to explore what those consequences might be, especially down the road.
The other side of that coin, though, is that some of those things, it's not the case that consequences are always negative, right? And so it may well be that, brace layout is a ridiculous thing, but my current pet peeve in Elixir is the trailing comma. Right? I think trailing commas are really very nice because it makes it far easier to edit code. And, the current formatter strips them out. Now, that's done based on opinion. Maybe there are some measures we can say, if we were doing this, a decent editor could probably capture and say, yeah, you know what, we could save 7 minutes a year or whatever the magic number might be. But whatever it might be, I mean, those are the kind of things where, there's no flame war, there's just facts. And if you don't have the facts, then it's just like, it's boring.
Yeah. And with that trailing common one, I've had that recently with the automated testers in the place that I'm currently working, where they're using, I think it's Airbnb's linter, and it drops the semicolons off the end of most lines in JavaScript. And I want to see that at the end, because then I know that that's the end of that line or the end of that function, that method. And they're not using it in every place, but some places they do. And it gets very confusing. But then, as you've said, it's an opinion thing, but it makes it easier for me, maybe, because I've grown up as a developer, seeing those syntax laid out in that way. That's what I want to see. I don't
Yeah,
know.
we have to be very careful, I think, and this is way past coding. I think as humans, we are genetically predisposed to be tribal, and we protect the tribe and we repel people that aren't part of the tribe, and I mean, we're seeing that in spades all around the world in a kind of geopolitical sense right now. But it also occurs in coding. And I mean, it occurs in my language is better than your language, my trailing comma is better than your space, all of that kind of basically bullshit that goes on is kind of baked into us. And I think one of the tricks is to try to work really hard to kind of like have that kind of meta consciousness thing going on, where you're looking at yourself and saying, oh, you know what? I said that, but I can't really back it up. Or I said that, but I'm really just saying that because that's what I've always done.
Yeah.
And trying to break out of that.
Yeah, the other half of that, and I totally agree with that, but the other half of that is that layered on top of that kind of tribal, let me just stick with this thing, we tend to visualize the world or our work or the project in a very static fashion. We try to wrap our head around it and say, okay, it is like this. Canonically, this is how it is. It will never change. And we try to take the snapshot and make that this kind of static reality, ignoring the dynamic aspects of the politics, the project, whatnot. So you look at all these sort of popular models that are out there. We're fans of the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. It says how you change as you gain and learn a skill, because it changes everything as you go from novice to expert. How you solve problems, what mental models you use, if you use them, how you relate to other people. All these things are dynamic and they change as you're learning. You look at the Cynefin framework, where it's, this is where the rant on best practices comes from. Best practices, don't work because they're typically ignorant of context. But even then, a best practice is only a solution in one particular quadrant in that model. Another quadrant, there's multiple best practices. In the quadrant where we live, they're emergent practices that you are kind of coming up as you're doing it. So even then, we're trying to look at this as a very static framework, and it's a much more robust, dynamic world that we live in. You look at Wardley maps. That's another popular buzzword, right? It's like, okay, well, this technology, you should be doing this kind of investment because you're inventing something that's brand new. You shouldn't invest in this because that's commodity now. And oh, by the way, that thing you're doing now that's novel and whatnot, here's the timeline as it becomes commodity, and all these other things change. So, on any axis you pick, we very much try to say, okay, well, this is the one agile method we're going to use, and we're going to use this forever, and we're not going to change. And the irony there just slays me. But, that's the kind of viewpoint that people have. We want static solutions to dynamic problems.
True. And I think from that conversation alone, I think that stands up that you could probably change it to the cynical pragmatic programmers, because it's an interesting topic, and I think you can debate it for hours on end. But I don't think would ever come to that final solution of this is how we're going to do it. But
we can't see that's actually the trick. because the real solution is to realize that there is no static solution, that there is no best practice. The solution is you have to figure it out as you go along. You have to keep discovering. You have to keep learning. You have to try stuff. You have to you have to experiment and see how it works. Like as Dave was just saying, it's like, well, we've always done it this way. What would happen if we didn't? We've been having trouble with the project requirements. What if we didn't have a product owner for the next 3 months? What if we, had the team involved directly? What would happen? What if we did this? What if we did that? The only way to advance is to try these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think that you guys, you're here as the pragmatic programmers from the book from 20 years ago. That having read through that book again, sort of realizing some of the stuff that I've taken for granted as industry standards, since we're talking about the right ways to do it, came from the Pragmatic Programmer. And the one that does stand out massively for me is rubber ducking, to the point where I was actually talking to my merch guy about getting rubber ducks in black and white with my logo on. And when you guys reached out about coming on and talking about the book, it just sort of floored me a little bit. I was like, right, I've literally just been talking about these rubber ducks, and this is where this comes from. And it wasn't till I started reading the new version that it popped back into my head that this is where this comes from. And I think there's a lot of things that I've been taught and just taken as gospel that came from that book. It's definitely been a testament to development, and maybe a cornerstone to the development landscape that a lot of people that I've spoken to don't realize that it is what it is.
Well, and I think some of that was beginner's luck on our part, but mostly it came from, there's a lot of things in the book that we made up for the sake of the book, for the sake of explaining concepts to people, and a lot of things that people were already doing that we just gave a name to or amplified. But it came out of our actual work with real clients. So just as Dave was saying, how DHH refactored Rails out of the 37 Signals app, this was really sort of our refactoring of, this was what we were telling clients. This is what we were working with people doing that was working and being successful. So our initial project idea was, well, let's just write this down as a white paper, a little something to help people get started. And it grew and became, the book as it is. But yeah, there were a lot of things in there, the drive principle, rubber ducking, tracer bullets, a lot of these things that have become commonplace and, widely discussed and talked about, that we just made up as a teaching device so people would remember it. So
well, to be fair, Robert, most of these things, we didn't make up the actual technique in that we observed them, and we observed people doing them, or we looked at commonalities between 2 or 3 teams and tried to extract the essence of what they were doing. So like rubber ducking came from Greg Pugh, who was a graduate student that I worked with way back in college, who had a rubber duck sitting on his terminal. So yeah, a lot of these things, like Andy says, we kind of like extracted and gave names to. I wouldn't claim too much. Maybe tracer bullets, but I wouldn't claim too much originality in terms of stuff, because it's all been done. It's all been done.
Yeah, and some of the people that I've spoken to about some of these techniques, they've said, well, what's that? And when I've explained it, they go, oh yeah, we do that, but they didn't have that name, which stands to what you said there, is that you gave it a name, and that's the name that I use because that's the developer circles that I've sort of grown as a developer in, and they just happen to have those terms.
There wasn't a Moliere play that one of the characters says, "Oh, I've been speaking prose all my life."
But that was an important. I think that's one reason why the book was so popular for so long and continues to be popular, is that it gave folks a kind of common vocabulary, so you could talk about these things without having the 20-minute discussion of, well, I'm doing this way, but I don't know what you call it. put a label to it. It's like, oh, okay, yes, tracer bullets, yes, rubber ducking, yes, dry, all these other things. Like, oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. Having, not even knowing where it came from, but now at least it's part of the vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, I mean, it's kind of interesting because for the last couple of weeks, I've been working with a voice artiste getting the audiobook version done, which is turning out to be an interesting challenge. But it's also the first time I've actually had the thing read out loud. And that changes a lot of the meaning. Well, not so much the meaning. It brings out new meaning when you hear it out loud. And one of the things that has been striking me as we're listening to it is there's actually probably a meta book in there somewhere, which is about 3 pages long, which is the underlying principles that we have across everything. So the idea of try it, see, work out what the feedback is, make a change, get the feedback, see if it was better or worse, is almost like a universal. It occurs almost everywhere in that book. And those kind of things, I think, are important because what we've tried to do, I think, is to, across all these different topics from, how to do a meeting to how to write code and how to name variables, all that kind of stuff has a unifying underlying philosophy, I guess. And I think if the book does anything, it does that. I think it shows that there are some simple generative ways of thinking about doing this.
Yeah, that meta book could be the tablets for the pragmatic programmer, like were brought down in the Bible from God and given to the people. These were given to the pragmatic programmers, and these are the rules to live by.
Except if I was doing that, I would carve them on ice because they shouldn't last more than about 12 seconds.
Yeah, right at the stand at the beach. That's where it goes.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying before. This is a very dynamic industry. The projects we create are very dynamic. They're in a dynamic web of, society and technology and people and all the rest of this nonsense. And, you look at think of the first line. Here's a good trivia question, right? What's the first line from the Agile Manifesto? We are uncovering better ways of developing software. It never said we're bringing down the 12 tablets from on high. This is the way you need to do it. It said, hey, we're figuring some stuff out, and here's some things that seem to work. And that's kind of very much our approach. Like, okay, we're still figuring this out. I mean, Dave and I have been programming for decades upon decades. Dave's a few more decades than me, but that's okay. But we're still figuring this stuff out. I can't claim that we have the stone tablets from on high. We're still working it out.
Yeah, but you're probably a little bit further along to figuring that all out than some of us. And I think the book is definitely one of those cornerstones for it. But as you said, maybe it's just that you guys were the first to get in there and write it down. I guess you never set out to write this book that was going to maybe stand the test of time as it has, really.
No, that was not our. I mean, it was a very pleasant side effect. We were delighted as it became very popular, but that we didn't see that coming. When we started, it was like, well, let's just write down a couple tips we can send to our clients. Something we can work with. And, we had been kind of informally doing these same little stories and little anecdotes and, dragging up these metaphors and whatnot. So we kind of had a kind of a shtick going, already. And so that kind of helped the process a bit. But we also worked really hard. I mean, we worked full time for over, a year and a half, to create this book, sometimes arguing over literally individual words.
Yeah.
This word has this connotation. Maybe we should use this other one. Maybe we should do that. So it was a very, very deliberate process. But even having done that, I mean, we just wanted to write the best book we could write. We did not figure we'd be sitting here 20 years later, still talking about it and having, creating a new version.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, I guess, that oddity that this book is 20 years old, but is still relevant in so many different ways for development. And maybe that's because we are still writing code today And 20 years ago, we were writing code. And as we said very early on, we are here solving problems with solutions. You know, we're not doing anything groundbreakingly different. We're just doing it in slightly different text than maybe what we were doing it before.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with some of that. I think we are doing a lot that's different. Just the sheer audacity of the stuff that we're doing now would take away the breath of people in 2000. But the thing that's in common is not what we're doing, it's who's doing it, right? The fact is that 99% of the problems in software are to do with people, you know? And the remaining problems are to do with JavaScript. So, yeah. But I mean, it's all people, and it's people's approach to things, people's problems, people's attitudes, their hopes, their blah 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 blah, right? And that's what hasn't changed. So there is very little in the book in the 20th edition. I mean, 20th edition is, I don't know what percentage has changed. It's a lot. I mean, it's well over 50. There's like a third of the tips are brand new. And most of the rest of them have changed dramatically. But the actual underlying message hasn't changed, because the underlying message is to do with people. And that's what's in common. So if the Pragmatic Programmer was written 50 years ago, and if it was written, at some point in the future before the singularity, it would have the same underlying message.
So if that message has been the same for 20 years and is the same message in the new book, what was it that drove you both to sort of say, well, we need to revise this, we need to bring this more up to date?
There was enough details had changed, and not just the sort of obvious stuff of programming languages and frameworks, because we referenced some stuff that it would be, it made it harder and harder to read if you didn't know about Eiffel back in the day, or about Corba, or about Motif, or whatever, any of the technology at the time. I mean, you can still go back and read Fred Brooks's Mythical Man Month, and he's talking about, the IBM and the OS 360 and these ancient technologies, and that gives it a bit of a patina that, oh, this is old, this, maybe this isn't applicable anymore. And of course, it's perfectly applicable to today. You can go in and substitute, any tech you want, and the message is still absolutely spot on. And similarly with us, so we had that kind of low-level stuff we had to change, where the examples, maybe used, a style that wasn't popular now. There are better ways to do it, using languages that were, had fallen out of favor, something a little bit more modern. But there was also, I think, some pretty significant changes in attitudes and approaches. In the old days, we urged you to have a build machine sitting in the corner to do continuous builds and continuous testing. Well, that's a little bit different now. That's probably done in the cloud. You push and there's a build pipeline off on a spot instance somewhere. So it's the same idea, but how you go about it and the possibilities, the advantages that affords you are better now. They're different. You can do more interesting things with it because we've come along in 20 years' time. So, it's very much building on the base of the first edition, but bringing it up to date with, all the modern conveniences. Now we've got indoor plumbing, or, whatever.
Yeah. So on that, if you've got, there's going to be a large section of the audience that they read the Pragmatic Programmer 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe last year. Are they going to get anything new from reading the updated version, or is it just about the paradigms that it's sort of that the book encompasses?
Well, Dave wrote a whole new section on concurrency. There's a good starting point. That's an entirely new chapter.
Yeah, that's actually true. Concurrency, we have a lot on. A lot of the book was, when we reread it 20 years later, we were kind of surprised to discover that because OO was then the kind of rising star, that a lot of the book was implicitly object-oriented. A lot of the terminology we used was OO terminology. And so we've gone through and In I was going to say moderated that, but really what we've done is extracted out the stuff that's actually the real meat and that doesn't depend on whether it's OO or functional or whatever else. And try to give that a name as opposed to calling things by classes and objects and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Sure. So there's definitely something for everybody in there, and I think that the book is written in such a way that it's accessible by everybody. I think some of these tech books that you pick up, they're so and to use a different version of the word dry, they are very dry and they can be very boring, and they just don't get things across in a nice and
Yeah, and
interesting way.
You know why that is? So what we discovered when we started the Pragmatic Bookshelf publishing company, and I think we kind of came to this kind of accidentally, but we've always tried to make our books, and starting with this one, about you, about the reader. Here's stuff that can help you. Here's something, we found that we think you'll find useful. And too many authors, especially first-time authors, will come in and say, hey, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to spray out, brain dump everything I know about a topic. Boom. And then they, vomit forth this epic 800-page tome of everything they know, which, okay, I can, scourge through that and, maybe dig up a couple interesting gems, but I would much rather you focus the book on me. It should all be about me. I'm reading the book. I want you to help my life. I want you to make my job easier. And, this is what we coach our authors at the bookshelf to say, yeah, okay, yes, you're an expert. That's why you're here. We know that. You don't have to prove that. You don't have to pull out every single thing you know. What you do need to do is get inside the reader's head and make it about them. Make it about, how can I present this? How can I convey this? How can I help them solve the problems that they're facing? And that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I think that sort of comes full circle with what we were talking about before we started recording. Was that with the podcast, I'm here to try and help the listeners to learn more about it. Where a lot of podcasts are there trying to prove to the listener how much the host knows, and they're splurging their knowledge. Going, this is what I know about it. Well, what does it do for me as a listener? Does it do anything for me?
Dear listener, your host is the smartest, most knowledgeable host
handsome
ever, and handsome as well. But I mean, that goes without saying.
Thank you.
I mean, you have never,
not me.
You've never heard a host with as much as this host.
The host with the most.
No. That understates it.
Right. So working with legacy code is often painful, and having to revisit anything you've done before is hard. Was that a problem for you guys when you came back to it? Did you look at it and think, why did we say that?
Not for the most part. I mean, for the most part, it was, to me at least, it was a really cool time capsule, because even something that we would look at and go, oh my God, we would never say that today. But you read it, it's like, well, sure, back then that made perfect sense, because this was the world, this was the context we were in at the time. So I found it a really nifty time capsule, just to go back and think about what the world was like 20 years ago, because a lot's changed in 20 years. Tech landscape. So yeah, I didn't have that sort of I know what you're talking about, because I've will go across monstrous legacy code from last week and think, oh my Lord, what was I thinking? That is the most horrible, awful idea ever. What possessed me? But no, I didn't really get a sense of that from anything in here. It was more, oh, that's an interesting point of history.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the thing is that in the 20 years since we first wrote it, we've been talking to people ever since about the stuff in the book. And so in those conversations, we've discovered different ways of explaining things, quite often better ways of explaining things. We discovered different sets of problems. People ask us, well, okay, I'm trying to do the dry principle, I'm doing this, right? And it's like, well, actually, that's not quite what it means. And whenever you find yourself saying to somebody, well, that's really not what it means, what you're really saying is, I explained it badly. Yeah. And so we get the opportunity to go back, which is so sweet, and rewrite history. We get to be able to fix those things. And that's been, for me, that was really enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier as well that there's going to be an audiobook, which is absolutely fantastic because I listen to a lot of stuff on Audible. I listen at 2.5, 3 times speed, get through a lot of books. I'm a horrendously slow actual reader.
You're not going to listen to this one at 2.5 times. No, because this is not a book. We're doing something a bit different.
Yeah. So I listen to a lot of things on these similar topics that, and I take it in a lot better. So getting these sort of books in audio form is going to be great. But if people wanted to get their hands on a physical copy, where would they do that?
So 2 things. The ebook is currently available, has been available from pragprog.com. We've got that now in all the ebook formats. The hardcover, and it's an actual hardback this time, not paperback, is coming out mid-September. I think is our current target, and that'll be available any place fine hardcovers are sold. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Okay, it's a short list, but whoever's left in the book market,
Nice.
Internationally, all those sorts of places.
Great. So we're almost out of time. You guys are very, very busy, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But just 2 last questions: do you think in 20 years' time you will be writing another version of this and bringing it up to date again?
No.
From our walkers.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I think that the thing that makes me feel that I'm still qualified to update this book is I still write code just about every single day. I am really, really down on so-called consultants who tell people how to do things that they can't do themselves. So I still code and I still play around with new stuff and everything else. So I'm pretty comfortable doing that. I think the reality is that, as time goes on, my ability to do that is going to go down simply because I'm going to drool a lot more. So I think the reality is no. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe the appropriate drugs will come along and, we'll write the 40th anniversary.
A frame from Futurama where you're a head in a jar and you could dictate it.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, we won't in 20 years from now, right? The AI will be writing the code. We'll just be kibitzing.
I was going to say, yeah.
That's cool because then we'll just have that same AI help us write the damn book for the next edition. So it all works out. It's all good.
Yeah. If it allows us to.
If it lets us, yeah. It'll take out all the jokes.
So if there was one tip that you could both give to the listeners that isn't go and buy the book, what would it be?
Buy a book. More generically, keep learning. Just always be learning. Learn something different. Learn something outside your comfort zone. Farther out, the better. Buy good books, not the sort of teach yourself X and Y days for dummies kind of low-hanging stuff. And don't just cruise Stack Overflow or YouTube. Actually have a good deep dive from an experienced practitioner who can give you the good hard-won advice that's not a 5-minute blog post. Like I said, Dave and I spent a long time, 2.5 people years writing this book. All the books on the bookshelf now, that's very common. Authors are spending a year putting a good quality book together. That's not going to be the same as a short blog post or a quip on Twitter or whatever it might be. And there are times you need that kind of deep dive to get into the subject matter and to keep learning. But I think that's the absolute critical thing to our industry and to staying in the industry is to just keep that going. Just keep learning something new, whether you use it in your day job or not.
Yep. As a developer, every day is a school day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that the thing I always tell people is whatever you do, make sure you're having fun, because what we do is incredibly difficult. It's very challenging. It's very frustrating at times. And if you're not having fun, then you got to ask why you're doing it, And I think what Andy was talking about, this attitude of exploring, of asking why, You come across something you didn't expect. Well, a good developer would, be like that dog in what was it, Up in the Air, squirrel, off they go, and go chase down that fact, because they take pleasure in learning all that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of attitude that I think is the most important. Take pleasure in learning.
Yeah, fantastic advice there from two people that have had a massive impact on my career, I think, over the years. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you for taking some time out from what is undoubtedly a very busy schedule to come and talk to us on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Pleasure is all ours. Yeah, but I do have to go because I'm actually teaching a class in a little while.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dave. And thank you to everyone out there for listening to Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas talking about 20 years of the Pragmatic Programmer. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help the Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.